My name is Drew Keller. I'm the director for the Institute for Business and Global Society, or BiGS for short. And this is our first BiGS debate, so thank you all for joining us. We will be discussing the important question, is big tech too big? But before we turn it over to our distinguished debaters, we want to know what all of you think. So if you could all just take out your phones, if you haven't done so already, scan this QR code, and just quickly vote on the proposition. Do you think big tech is too big? Do you not? Or are you unsure? We'll also have you vote at the end to see which team wins, so that'll be exciting. Yeah, so just the QR code there. At BiGS, we really believe in fostering thoughtful discussion and debate on complex and contentious issues, which today is a really good example of. But we really couldn't have done this without the support of Steve Klinsky, who was an MBA grad in 1979, and a law school grad in 1981, and his family and his wife, Maureen, as well. They were really interested in fostering reasoned and structured debate on campus, and this is a great example of that. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Debora Spar, Senior Associate Dean for Business and Global Society, who will moderate today's debate.
So thank you all for being here. We are super excited to have this inaugural BiGS debate. And today is an opportunity to argue and fight and get into heated conversation, not just for the fun of watching these brilliant people get into some heated debates, but more importantly, to underscore the point, as Drew just mentioned, that there are many things in our world today, including really big, critical, maybe even existential things, about which reasonable people may disagree. And the source of the disagreement is not because any of these apparently reasonable people, in fact, are unreasonable or evil or misinformed, but because the world is a complicated place. And the issues that we all care about are complicated to understand and to unpack. And even some of the smartest and most well-informed and knowledgeable people bring their own viewpoints and their experiences and maybe their own curated sets of facts to what would appear to be the same questions. So the immediate goal for this afternoon is to resolve in the next 90 minutes one of the toughest and most consequential issues facing U.S. business and U.S. society today. Is big technology too big? The longer-term goal of this series, though, is to engage and demonstrate one of the central objectives of Harvard Business School, and what I think should be one of the central objectives of any academic institution and any well-functioning society, to debate, to argue, to disagree, and to try to identify slices of common ground, and even more importantly, perhaps, to change one's mind as a result of engaging with these issues and with these controversies. So we hope to get some good fights today, as I said, and we hope this is the first in what will be a long series of BiGS debates. So anyone who has further ideas for the next debate, which will be in the fall, let me or Drew or anyone on the team know. So let me just begin with a few really quick statistics to set the stage. As of today, the US Magnificent Seven, which you all know is Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, NVIDIA, and Tesla, holds a combined market value of $15 trillion. That's about 1/3 of the S&P 500, or around 1/4 of the entire US stock market. To put that in global perspective, these 7 companies together are worth more than the entire economies of Japan, Germany, or India, and they come close to China. 2024, these firms saw their stock prices surge on average by 63%, which accounted for more than half the gain of the S&P for that year. Which raises the question we're dealing with today, is big tech too big? Or is it precisely the right size to drive growth, innovation, and wealth? To unpack this question, we are incredibly lucky to have a wonderful set of debaters. Most of them will be well known to you. I will just give you the very quick sort of big picture of their bios. To my immediate left is Jonathan Kanter. Jonathan is the former Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, so he has been living and breathing these questions. He served from 2021 to 2024, during which time he reshaped antitrust enforcement in terms of its focus and filed landmark lawsuits against the tech giants Google and Apple, Google and Amazon, Apple. Yeah. There we go, along with less high-profile but arguably equally important firms such as Live Nation, Visa, Simon & Schuster, and Adobe. Prior to serving the Biden administration, he worked at the FTC and a number of major law firms. He will be arguing for the proposition that big tech is too big. On that side, he will be joined by Professor Timothy Wu, who is the Julius Silver Professor of Law, Science, and Technology at Columbia Law School. Tim has often been described as the architect of the Biden administration's antitrust agenda. He has been working in this space for decades now, coined the term net neutrality, and is the author of many books, including The Curse of Bigness. So we know what side he's going to be on. On the other side of the small table there, arguing against the proposition that big tech is too big, we have Gary Cohn and Jason Furman. Jason Furman is the Aetna Professor of the Practice of Public Policy, jointly appointed at the Kennedy School and the Department of Economics here at Harvard. He was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration and played a key role in advising President Obama and shaping his economic policy. He's, in addition to co-teaching Harvard's iconic course, Principle of Economics, he's the senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and served recently as chair of the Digital Competition Expert Panel in the UK, designed to help that country revisit and revise its competition policy. And last but no least, Gary Cohn. Gary is currently vice chair of IBM. He served previously as director of the National Economic Council in the first Trump administration, where he led the administration's economic policy agenda with a focus on successful efforts to grow the economy, create jobs, and increase wages. Prior to his time in the government, Gary was at Goldman Sachs for over 25 years, where he served as president and COO. He began his career at U.S. Steel and sits on a number of corporate boards, advises the FDIC, and is deeply involved in supporting NYU Langone and the NYU Tandon School. So we couldn't ask for a better group. They are ready to fight. Here is very quickly how things will proceed for the next 85 minutes or so. We have asked each debater to present 5 minutes of opening arguments. After each side has finished their arguments, each debater will have 3 minutes to rebut what they heard the other side say. Then I will try and pull out sort of the most contentious pieces of their statements. We'll get them to fight a little bit more directly, and then we will turn things over to the audience for questions. We have a number of pre-selected questions from students sitting in the audience here, and if time permits, we'll open it up a little bit more broadly. And then we will have closing statements, and then we will ask you all to vote again. And remember, the goal of the exercise is not just to see which side wins, but which side convinces more of you to change your mind. So, before I turn things over to Jonathan, who is going to be our first debater, I would like to present to you our preliminary vote results. Thank you, Drew. Ooh, that's a little surprising. Is big tech too big? Yeses got 70% of the votes, so you guys have a little bit of an uphill battle. No's got 18%, and do not want to answer got 12%. So there are your swing votes there to go after. But we will start first with the yes side. So Jonathan, please tell us why big tech is too big.
Well, as any good lawyer would say with those numbers, we rest and we send it over to the defendants. Take a journey with me back a few months ago. It's January 2025. The president-elect is getting prepared for inauguration. It's cold in Washington, winter in Washington, and the president-elect decides to break from tradition. Instead of having the inauguration outside of the Capitol steps, President-elect says, I want to have it inside the Capitol Rotunda. So here you have this, and you can imagine this in your mind's eye. Inside the Rotunda, you have the president, it's nice and warm. Outside, you have a lot of people, I won't say how many, but a lot. Not the biggest crowd ever, I think, but, and it's cold. The rank and file, the people who supported the president because they believed him, are cold outside celebrating the day. Inside the Rotunda, cozy and warm, right there in the front, alongside the president's family, in front of the incoming cabinet are the CEO and founder of Google, CEO of Apple, Mark Zuckerberg from Meta, and whatever Elon Musk is. That is too much power. People need to be physically, but more importantly, metaphorically, inside the Rotunda. When I think about whether companies have too much power, I think across three different dimensions. Do they have too much political power? Too much power over the direction of our society? Do they have too much economic power? And are they using their money to reinvest back into the economy? And third, do they exert too much power over others in the ecosystem? So let's unpack that. Political power. Not only are they in the Rotunda, we are here in 2025, given all the information we collect, that we still do not, to this day, have comprehensive privacy reform. Any legislation, there are no lines on the road, not for lack of trying and not for lack of partisan agreement. It's because big companies have so much political power they can lobby against it. They influence and control what people see, what people think. Billions, 5 companies controlling billions. Let's take a look at the economics now, okay? The Mag 7 collectively have over $500 billion in cash reserves. Over $500 billion of money that is parked on the sidelines, that is not being reinvested back into the economy. From 2020 to 2023, I think estimates are about the Mag 7 spent over $700 billion in stock repurchases. Again, money that is not being reinvested back into the economy in terms of innovation and jobs. That is a multiple higher than what these companies spent in research and development. A lot of the CapEx now among the Mag 7 are paying each other, whether it's paying NVIDIA for chips or Google paying Apple over $20 billion a year for search defaults. Okay, now let's take a look at the control they have over others. And this is something that really resonates with me due to my former role at the Antitrust Division. These companies are so big, they function as unaccountable regulators of their industries. They are not innovating by making their products better. They are protecting their monopoly position by making other people's products worse. What do I mean by that? They're going out and saying, I'm going to spend $20 billion, and in exchange for that $20 billion, you have to agree company have to agree not to work with somebody else. I'm going to make it so that you can't offer a buyer a lower price because I'm going to penalize you on my shopping platform if you do that. I'm going to go and I'm going to say, as one of these companies, that if you want to charge your app at a lower price or put a link to your own website inside of your app, I'm going to forbid you for doing that because someone might click on that link and pay less money. Right? I can give you examples like this all day. They're in our lawsuits. That is not investing to make your product better. That is not taking the money that's sitting on the sidelines. That is not using your political power to invest in development and entrepreneurship. It's too much power. We need more competition to make sure they are doing better and to make sure we can realize the benefits of innovation. I'm here at Harvard Business School. I believe in you. I believe in the next generation of entrepreneurs who can come up with that better idea. I believe in the next generation of entrepreneurs who could build a better product and who can maximize terminal value, not just by selling to the large companies, but by displacing them altogether.
Thank you. We are at time. Thank you. Jason, over to you. First argument against the proposition that big tech is too big.
So if you had invited me to do this debate 5 years ago, I might have actually been happy to be on that side. And when I say happy to be on that side, It's because maybe 70-30 on that side. Now I'm happy to be on this side, and I'm happy to be on this side more like 70-30. If your answer to this question is a definitive yes or a definitive no, and if you've had that same answer year after year after year, you're just not paying attention, and you're not looking at the evidence. So why have my views evolved? 5 or 10 years ago, I thought we had several companies that had impregnable network effects, impregnable scale that would make it impossible for anyone else to come along. Then TikTok came along and displaced an awful lot of what Meta was doing. Then Twitter grew, and it turned out when Meta tried to create its own version of a social network like Twitter, it just wasn't as good in terms of its features, and as a result, it hasn't been successful. When Google had an enormous lead in terms of data and AI, they actually used their really deep research budget to publish a paper on the transformers architecture, a paper that was publicly available, and then other companies, most notably OpenAI, used that research that was produced by that company to create something that I wouldn't be surprised if fully replaces Google search in a couple of years. So it turns out being the incumbent is a little bit less good than I thought it was. And there was more competition in social networks, and especially and most importantly, it wasn't like you could take your lead in the first sphere and translate it into the second sphere. We've seen OpenAI, we've seen Anthropic, and then with even less money going into it, we've seen DeepSeek. So there's more competition in this space than I had realized. The second thing is, why are these companies big? They're big for two reasons. The main reason is that people like their products, that they're good at what they do. And when they become less good at what they do, they actually become less big. And that's what we might end up seeing with Google search if they can't keep up with the way that OpenAI is searching. So bigness isn't a good or a bad thing inherently. It's why are you big? And that's most of the reason. Now, some of the reason is some of the conduct that they engage in, some of the acquisitions, and some of the behavior. And Jonathan brought a terrific case against Google. And I largely agreed with that case and largely agreed with the judge's decision on it. But then that gets to the last thing, which is, so you're bothered by some of the aspects of bigness. Is the solution worse than the problem? And here's where I'm torn. I read what the Justice Department wanted to do with Google, and it wanted to make a lot of people use Bing as their search engine instead of Google. Bing is something consumers consider a worse search engine than Google. And so it's a little bit of a speculative theory that if we push more people over to Bing, eventually Bing will get better, and eventually they'll be better off. But I think ultimately we can't have some sort of grand falutin theory about how we want to redo the world. We have to defer a lot to people and to the choices that they make, and pushing people over to that would be problematic. Finally, the other thing that's changed over the last 5 years is the salience of the geopolitical aspect of this issue, and in particular of the incredible importance of the competition with China and the incredible contrast between the success of the United States, where we have these magnificent 7, and Europe, which would love nothing more than to have 7 companies like the 7 that we have that started and were nurtured here in the United States. Here, too, there's some complications. More competition, more innovation is good for our geopolitics. But in general, why you would want to hobble, especially when it comes to AI, and that was something where when the Justice Department said that part of their remedy was basically breaking up Google's AI from Google's search, so they couldn't use their search information to improve their AI. I thought the people that were probably most excited about that were people sitting in Beijing who thought with their lesser concern about some of these topics, they would be nurturing something that was more competitive. So there's a lot more competition in this space. The reason these companies are big is because consumers like them, and if you tried to break them up and solve them, many of your problems would still be there. Some of them would actually be even worse.
Thank you. Tim.
Well, thanks. Well, I'm glad to, listening carefully what Jason had to say, I'm glad to say he's basically on our side in the sense that he agrees and is forced to acknowledge that in order for us to have the best tech industry in the world, it has to be a competitive tech industry. And that, in fact, holding the feet of the major tech firms to the fire, forcing them to compete, forcing them not to pay off their competitors, like Google was trying to do with Apple, is actually in the interest of the United States. So let me back up a little bit and start with a few points that we know from the history of the tech industry and the history of monopoly. Monopolists often start off as great companies, very popular, good products. That's usually how they get there. But as time goes on, they tend to be and become fat and lazy. In other words, they tend to become complacent. They tend to rely on products and business models that are tested, and they increasingly begin to see that there are advantages to becoming a partner with government or investing in other forms of barriers to entry to prevent them from being challenged. All of this is stuff that both Jason and Gary know well. And while it's still relatively early, the fact is that the tech companies are on their way and have every sign of becoming the next Boeings of the United States. They started with great products, they're incredibly innovative, and have large amounts of scale, and I think all of that is very important. But we are starting to see in ways little and small, whether it was, as we said, the various little ways in which they find ways to pay off or buy or pay not to compete, in the ways that the tech industry is suddenly taking a liking to government contracts, to influence of government over government, all the signs that the tech industry is on a path becoming more and more like the defense military industrial complex, a situation where the companies realize that it's easier and better not to compete, and easier and better to both rely on government contracts and lack of competition to maintain an easy life. That is why my part of the thesis is that big tech has got too big for its own interests. And if we want to wind back a little bit and talk about the geopolitical aspects of this, let's turn back to the 1970s for a moment. During that period, the United States was dominated technologically by two companies, IBM and AT&T. Both of them were large companies, monopolies in their spheres. Both of them at one point had been incredibly innovative and had dazzled people with their innovations. But by the 70s and 80s, they were getting older, and they were challenged by an overseas geopolitical rival, Japan, which was then considered to be the most advanced, threatening country in the United States based on its technology and based on the fact that it had a government that was supporting its tech giants at the time, AT&T and NEC. What did the United States do? Did we say, oh no, these companies are so big that they need our support and they are our national champions that we are going to defend at all costs? No. We broke up AT&T. We sued IBM in a long lawsuit which forced them to unbundle software and forced them to make room for the rise of the personal computer industry. And the result of these policies was a rise of a whole new generation of companies, including Apple, Microsoft, and ultimately, much later, the tech industry after the Microsoft lawsuit. My point is that it has been a successful U.S. policy to constantly force competition onto the tech industry through antitrust and through other policies to make sure that it stays competitive, that it does not become the next Boeing, that it does not become the next General Motors, that it does not become one of these industries that just dominated by a few companies that never leave. I think our policies have worked. I think the reason we are the world's dominant tech power is because we have always forced our tech sector to compete, and we've never let them get away with the excuse that we're the national champions of the United States or we need scale. It's always the same story. We need scale and monopoly to be great. We need to pursue what we've always done and that which has worked best in the tech industry, promote innovation, and find the next little Microsofts, little Apples, little Googles, and little Facebooks, and give them room to do their thing.
Thank you. Finally, Gary.
Can we talk about how that worked out for IBM? I'm going to bring that up because I'm not sure. Looking at the history 50 years later, it might look like the best thing the U.S. government did for a lot of companies around the world, but we won't go there. So I'm the non-academic in this room, and I know I'm at Harvard Business School. I bet you there's a bunch of entrepreneurs in this room that want to start businesses. And I bet you none of you want to start a small business. I bet you all want to build a big business. I bet you all understand that all big businesses started as small businesses. In fact, I think a company called Facebook started in a dorm room at Harvard. I think it was 1 or 2 people that started a small business that became a big business. No one starts a small business because they want to be a small business. Everyone starts a small business because they want to be a big business. How do small businesses become big businesses? They provide goods and they provide services for people that they need. You paid a lot of tuition to find that out. So let me go back to the major topic here. You guys keep arguing an issue that I am confused if you're arguing size matters, regulation matters, or law matters, because you keep arguing that people are breaking laws. If companies are breaking laws, I don't think this side of the room is going to advocate that companies should be allowed to break laws. No company should be allowed to break laws. If you're arguing that we have a bad regulatory environment, we should fix the regulatory environment. I'm very pro good, smart regulation. I spent 26 years of my life in a highly regulated industry. We can really thrive in highly regulated industry. So if that's what you're arguing, go ahead. We're going to probably be supportive of those arguments. You're also making this argument that we know exactly what's going to happen in the world. Like you said, and you knew to break up AT&T and you knew to break up IBM. Well, AT&T, like the day you broke it up was the exact same day that cell towers were coming into this country. I bet you none of these kids have a landline in their room anymore. They don't know what a landline looks like. In fact, when mine rings at home, my kids look at it like, what is that obsolete thing? So, at the exact time you were breaking up this dominant company, it was becoming obsolete. People wrote the same thing about Sears and Roebuck. Sears and Roebuck, for those of you that don't know, was the Amazon of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was the only place to buy the vast majority of things in this country. Kodak was one of the most important companies in the world. And guess what? Kodak got disintermediated because they were the only one that sold film. And believe it or not, you had to actually take a picture and film and have it developed. We have a long history in this country of companies thriving. And if they don't reinvent themselves, they don't produce the product that people need, they somehow disappear. And by the way, that's fine. That's natural evolution. So I don't think we should be sitting here and be smart enough to say, we know what the world's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. In fact, there was a fairly substantial research piece published yesterday talking, and I think the headline was something like, is Google the next Kodak? It was published yesterday talking about, is Google sticking to their ways because they only know search, they know typing in, and is Chat, GPT, and other AI engines going to put them out of business? A second point that I would make is, you talk about this lack of competition. Best I can tell, there was about $400 billion that I can count invested in startup companies last year. And I'm sure I'm missing a lot of it. That's $400 billion that if you want me to document, I can document. $400 billion plus. And I think there's a lot more than that going in because of what's going on in AI. So there's no shortage of startup capital. There's no shortage of people looking to be creative, looking to start new companies. There's no stifling of creativity going on by these large dominant companies. In fact, these large dominant companies in many respects are providing startup capital for many of the companies. You talk about the Mag 7 in the United States. Well, you know what? The competition for the Mag 7 is the Mag 1, called the Chinese government. If you know, in China, most of the companies are state-owned enterprises. So look, we have 7 companies trying to compete against one company, and one of them is actually a car producer. The companies that are really more important in the Elon Musk world are probably the space company and the Boring company and other things like that. So, there's a lot of things going on here. We know that the world changes quickly. We should have an environment that allows and facilitates for change. We should continue to provide an environment where companies can thrive. There is competition. You may not like the competition, but I went through and counted in search engines. There's at least 10 search engines. You may not like them. They may not be as good, but they clearly exist, and they're there, and they're all making money. They're all profitable today. All of these search engines are profitable today.
Thank you. All right, so we're now going to give each of the debaters an opportunity to rebut sort of the part of your opponent's arguments that made you most upset. Tim, I'm going to ask you to start on this side.
Sure. I don't know, upset is the right word, but I want to tackle two questions here. Our opponents have taken the position that suggests that companies, the moment they become obsolete, disappear. The moment they're no longer competitive, that's the end of them. And that, therefore, if a monopoly or a tech company is no longer the best, that it'll go away. Now, there are tendencies in that direction. I'm not going to deny that. But I want to suggest to you that there is a storied history of companies sticking around way past their prime and using anti-competitive and illegal tactics to stay there for very long periods of time. AT&T is a good example. AT&T, by the 1960s and 70s, had basically settled. They were no longer going to do much else. Bell Labs was doing a lot of stuff. AT&T was happy with the phone system the way it was. Internet technologies came along. They were like, these are never going to work. Forget it. Only when the FCC started being tough on AT&T, and only when we broke it out, did you actually have the explosion that led to the internet. So I just think it's flat out wrong to say that monopolies cannot defend themselves. The number one way that monopolies defend themselves is they turn to government for support and for protection against competition. And I see many signs. I think the Silicon Valley is turning towards government. Elon Musk is the most obvious example of it, and becoming more and more like the defense industry. The defense industry is still the same damn companies from however long ago. Lockheed Martin and Boeing and a few other companies are still the same companies that have been around for decades. And I think they have very effectively insulated themselves for competition. I think the tech industry information tech would love to go in that same direction. So I just deny, and I think the important role that other sides of government play, and even for itself, tech being too big, is it needs to be an industry that is constantly able to be subject to competition so that it actually gets better. Otherwise, I think it'll stagnate, and that's the thing that I want to point out most of all.
Thank you. Jason, do you want to rebut some of the specifics?
Sure. Want to bring up really 2 points. A couple of years ago, in 2019, I did a debate on the Upper West Side in New York on whether the financial system is safer. I went in with an enormous amount of detail on capital ratios and leverage ratios and the like. My opponent said, how could anything be safe when Donald Trump is president? And the entire Upper West Side audience voted against me. I would hate to see this audience be as unsophisticated as that Upper West Side audience. If this debate, as Jonathan would like it to be, is do you think Elon Musk is a thoughtful, diligent, hardworking person who unerringly does things in the interests of the world, yes or no, I think I would lose this debate. But his presence in this government actually shows how much of a red herring this is in linking it to big tech. He's not someone who is a particular monopolist in any important respect. He is someone where most of his companies are not fat and lazy. They're incredibly innovative. He has a disproportionate amount of power in our system with his $400 billion. Guess what? Take away 3/4 of it. He only has $100 billion. That's still a decent amount of money, enough that he could probably afford to spend $25 million or whatever it was down the drain on a judicial race in Wisconsin. And the issues that he has with his power in the government are a set of really, really important issues. But they're not issues that are going to be solved by antitrust policy. They're not issues that would be solved by breaking up companies. They're just not something that we can deal with outside of things like the campaign finance system, which gets to how money translates into politics, which is in very serious need of reform. And you don't want to be the antitrust enforcer that just because you have a hammer, you think everything is a nail, and you think there's some antitrust way to reduce the power of Elon Musk. The second thing that Jonathan said, and I thought if this is sort of the best argument for that side, I'm less, rather than 70-30 on my side, I'm now 90-10, is that they have $500 billion. Why aren't they doing something with it? I didn't understand that. You want Google to be buying more companies and expanding more. Instead of giving money to its owners, you want it to maybe buy GM and become a car company, become even more of a car company than it is. If you're worried about the size and scale of these companies, you want them to give their money out. Again, do I want a tax reform that levels the playing field between corporate buybacks and dividend payouts? Sure. Not sure, actually, emphatically so. But the idea that the sort of government would have some view as to whether this money is better in the hands of Google buying and expanding itself or paying it out in buybacks, and what do you think happens? The money doesn't disappear. It goes to those startups that Gary was talking about. It goes to other parts of the economy. And the very last thing I'll say in my negative 30 seconds is Tim wants this new small baby apples, the baby Googles, the baby this and that. OpenAI, Anthropic, Perplexity. We have a lot of that in our country right now, frankly, more than I thought we'd be able to have with the tech giants. Let's not try to do anything to stifle that innovation.
Jonathan, you can pick up any piece of this, but I think the sort of antitrust as a particular hammer is an obvious one. I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
I'm excited to be a hammer. This
Good.
is pretty fun. So let's unpack what Jason said here, respectfully, of course, which is that it's okay because China is going to save us and they're going to be competitive. It's okay because Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are going to fight it out. The fact of the matter is when 7 companies have a market cap that rivals China, that should worry us. When it turns out that so much of our index is tied to a small amount of companies, that should worry us. Yes, we have some new startups. Who here knows who's investing in OpenAI? Microsoft. Okay, who's investing in Anthropic? Yeah. Anthropic? Amazon and Google, right? Jason, you were wrong about our remedy. We didn't say that. We simply said that Google should divest its interest in Anthropic so that it has to compete against Anthropic with respect to search. No, we said, yes, we said that publishers should have the choice of whether they want to give, if they want to give their information to Google for search, they shouldn't be forced to give it to them for AI. They should have the ability to say, I can give you my information for search, and guess what, Anthropic? I think you're more innovative. I think you're going to give me a better deal. I want you to use my information for AI. It's about creating choice and optionality, right? The fact of the matter is, when we were at the Antitrust Division, who was coming in, to your point, Gary, and telling us that they had a problem, that they couldn't compete? It was those startups. They were saying that they had better ideas, and they weren't able to reach the market, not because the companies had too much money, because they were imposing contractual restrictions that blocked the market. My point about the $500 million, my point about these capital restrictions, the question of this debate is, are they too big? Tim said companies that get big, they get lazy and they get defensive. When companies are using their power to box out others rather than innovate, that's a sign that maybe they're too big for their own good. When they're hoarding value rather than spinning off assets to shareholders, that could mean they're too big. When they have so much money, $500+ billion, and then they're going to the government asking for free handouts to build data centers and energy instead of spending their own damn money, that's too big. That's a problem. Also, let's break this down too. And I think this is where a lot of the natural instinct comes from. They have a tremendous amount of power over what we see, what we think, how we live our lives. And they do it with no transparency and no accountability, right? So the question I think we're here to ask is, okay, is there a problem? There's a separate question, is what is the solution? Sometimes it might be nothing. Sometimes it might be some antitrust enforcement like a hammer. Sometimes it might be privacy regulation. Sometimes it might mean investments in science and research, and I have 30 seconds extra because of Jason. Science and research, so that the companies of today, these Mag 7, guess who invested in them? You, taxpayers, DARPA, NASA, university grants, funded the scientific research that was used for everybody, right? This is how we should invest in the next generation of technologies. But telling these companies that you can hoard all this money without sharing it, investing it back, and that you can keep your power simply by boxing others out through contractual restrictions and other methods, That is not a sign of a healthy market. That is not a sign of companies that are nimble and innovative.
Gary, once again, you get the final word here.
Yeah, I just get more and more confused the more I sit here. So, look, I agree that every.
You're not an academic.
I'm not an academic. I agree. I'm just a business guy. Look, not every startup's going to survive. There's risk in investing in startups. So I understand the ones that aren't going to survive are going to come complain. I understand. When my kid's not enjoying something, they come complain to me too. I get it. I get how it works. But you're telling me that Sequoia and Code2 and KKR and Silver Lake, they're not making investments in good companies that don't have good products and they're running billions of dollars of capital? I think they're investing in pretty good companies. They have pretty good track records. I look at their returns. They're pretty good. I think most people would be pretty happy with their returns. So the vast majority of these startups are succeeding. And yes, there are a bunch that are failing. Again, you keep wanting to talk about the Mag 7 versus China. Again, China's not an open market. If the state-owned enterprises were all allowed to go public, there's some really big companies there. I don't think we're making a fair and just comparison. So I don't understand why it's the Mag 1, the Chinese government, versus our public companies. And then there's just something that's under my skin that I have to get out of here, and I'm probably going to disagree with all three of you on this, but it's okay. Companies buy back stock because of something that the Democratic Party did in 2008. Elizabeth Warren, Sanders, Frank, you go back to it. They decided that company executives should, quote unquote, eat their own cooking, which means that the vast majority of executives in companies today, and this is fine, I think this is right, should get paid in equity-based compensation, stock-based compensation. If you pay people in stock-based compensation and invest over 3, 4, 5 years, if you just continue to pay the vast majority of your people in equity-based compensation and you don't repurchase it, it's highly dilutive to your existing shareholders, which are mostly pensions and endowments and the retail public. Do you want to sit there and dilute out pensions, endowments, and retail public? Look, we could say you can't take your share count down. You can keep your share count constant. But if you don't repurchase stock, and you keep issuing stock every year, you just create these massive dilution factors. And it's a really bad place to end up. And we shouldn't end equity-based compensation. We should just allow companies to maintain a constant share count. And it's a big red herring that a lot of people like throwing around. I don't think it's relative to this conversation. And I'll give you back my 30 seconds.
All right, thank you. All right, so thank you all so much. I want to try and pull out what I see as a couple of the sort of points of disagreement, or maybe even some agreement. But let me start with what I see as sort of the most fundamental, and that is the nature of competition. And I may be exaggerating a little bit, but Gary, what I think I hear you saying, and the history I hear you relating, is that competition kind of just happens. This is the Schumpeterian creative destruction. Companies are small, they do good things, they get big, they get lazy, and the next win comes along. And what we need to do is just kind of get out of the way. Tim, what I heard you say, I think quite explicitly, is that competition's not so natural, that we need government in one form or another to kind of make sure that that competition occurs, so that you need governmental intervention in order to keep the free market functioning. So maybe a little bit more on this. Is competition natural, or do you need government to make it happen?
Yeah.
Anyone, yeah.
I'll start on that. So, Joseph Schumpeter had this theory that capitalism is a process of creative destruction, and you'd have companies take monopoly and destroy by the next company. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think companies are also very good at stopping that cycle. In other words, that is what they do. If they can, they go out and try and find some way to prevent being replaced, because who wants to be replaced? I mean, it's natural. Once you're in power, you try and stay there. And so that is what I think has historically in tech been the role of government. When it came to IBM in the 1970s, chasing IBM around, breaking up AT&T, attacking Microsoft when Microsoft was the dominant company.
Goes back to
and
Western
then allowing all
Union
these
in this
companies,
country.
I think if these guys had won the debate, IBM and AT&T would still be the dominant companies of American tech, and I think we would be a second-rate power in tech. I think the fact that those companies were replaced by companies like Apple and Microsoft, and then later on the tech companies, Google, Facebook, whatever. That is the turning of the cycle. But I'm suggesting where Schumpeter was wrong is in assuming that automatically happens by itself because companies are great at insulating. The counterexamples come from Europe, Japan, and also other industries. Japan never attacked its monopolist. Japan never attacked its big computing. And they're basically stopped really innovating in the 80s and 90s. They're what we would have been. US tech would be like Japanese tech if we hadn't had antitrust intervention. And Europe's the same story. Look in Germany, they never really took on it's not T-Mobile, Deutsche Telekom properly, never broke this up. And, the European tech, and there's other reasons too. There's a lot more investment in venture capital here and stuff like that. But I'm trying to suggest that it has been the successful policy in the United States to keep turning the creative cycle of destruction and have industrial succession. If these guys won the argument, we'd still have IBM and AT&T. They would be like Boeing, Kodak, and other industries stagnant. Yeah.
That's a slightly peculiar argument, Tim, in that most experts who have looked at this have thought that European antitrust is much more vigorous than American antitrust. Some people, like Professor Thomas Phillipson at NYU, think that's been a good thing and has helped lower prices in Europe. Other people have said, oh, this is part of European overregulation and thought it was a bad thing. But the idea that they're sort of laissez-faire on competition and we're strict on it, I think gets it exactly backwards. I do agree with you.
The 70s and 80s.
I do agree with you that one of my favorite book titles, and it's somewhat dangerous to recommend it in this room, is a book called Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists by Raghu Rajan and Luigi Zingales. It's a very good book, but the title's even better than the book. And I agree. Businesses do not like competition. Their whole goal is to not have competition. That's why antitrust law is really important. That's why Jonathan's enforcement of it was really important when he was doing it. That's also, though, why you don't want to overregulate. You look at something like GDPR in Europe, and that created a set of rules around privacy that were much easier for the large companies to navigate than the small companies, and made it actually harder to have competition and challenging. So sometimes when the government does more and gets more involved in something, it can actually lead to less competition, not more. So one needs to be, really, really careful about that. And the last thing I'd say is absolutely, I understand that OpenAI wouldn't exist today without Microsoft. I think, first of all, that's an argument for Microsoft, that you need something at this scale to fund it at this scale. And it doesn't look like OpenAI is a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft anymore. It has a lot of investors, a lot of funders, evidently, including Gary. If anything, there's like a little bit of tension between them and their original parent. And by the way, they're doing a lot of work with other companies too. So I wouldn't put that down as like just a Microsoft can entrench its dominance. This is a great example of creative destruction.
Let me throw in one more wrinkle before you guys jump in, because I think we have this question here of, A, do you need some form of intervention to keep the markets working competitively? And then sort of B, is that intervention best done through antitrust or through regulation? Or, and here's the second wrinkle, is the real concern here keeping competitive markets, or is it keeping monopoly power from influencing political cycles, which is a different set of rules or hammers you might think about?
Yeah. Can I ask Jonathan two questions about that? One, would you want to do an antitrust action if it helped democracy but made consumers worse off? So do you think there's multiple objectives for antitrust, and one of the objectives actually is to think about the political system, and that only means anything if you're willing to trade it off? And then the second question is, how would you reduce the size of SpaceX, XAI, or whatever it's called, Tesla and the Boring Company and Neuralink and all of them, in order to reduce Elon Musk's political power? I mean, that was your big opening example. How do you'd shrink those companies to reduce his political power? How would you do that?
So I think there are a few different dimensions here. Let me try to unpack them. First, the question is this good, right? Are we happy as a society with this small number of companies having that much power? And then if the answer is it's a problem, what do you do about it? And I think it's important to separate those two questions. The antitrust laws exist to protect competition in the competitive process. That is the value that Congress put forward starting in 1890 and then again in 1914 and then multiple other times. Why? Well, to some degree it doesn't matter, right? Congress just said so. But the reason we like a competitive economy, to the point Tim was making, is it results in all sorts of different benefits. A competitive economy results in lower prices and better output, more innovation, better wages. It also means deconcentration of power. We don't have when we were at DOJ, we didn't have a political meter. Oh, this is going to raise this amount of political influence or that much.
No, I
amount
know
of
you
political
weren't doing that. I'm thinking what
No.
ought to
So
do.
my point is this, which is the reason antitrust is a desirable tool is it's not regulatory. It's only going after companies that are found to have violated the antitrust laws, and you have to prove that in court in front of a judge. The alternative is regulation, where you basically put regulation up for an entire industry, and then now the government is trying to essentially pull levers. That is far more complicated, especially in dynamic industries. And so my view is what you want is as a frontline defense, you want competition in a free market to try to figure out as many of those problems, right? And then if there are market failures or safety or security, then you may need some regulation. Now, it's not lost on me, and I think I heard Gary loud and clear, I'll wrap it up, that a lot of the concerns we're talking about, to Tim's point, companies, the big incumbents get most aggressive when there's a new inflection point. And that's when enforcement's most important. AI is a new inflection point. AT&T case preceded the development of IBM. The IBM case preceded the development of Microsoft. Microsoft case, at the urging of IBM, by the way, preceded the development of Google. The Google case is now preceding the development of AI. What we want is a competitive economy to work so that we don't have to go into a massive invasive regulation.
But Jonathan, you didn't say
Wait,
anything about how you would shrink Elon Musk's companies to reduce his power. I mean, that just seems like a totally unrelated.
You guys want to complain about Boeing, but then someone takes on Boeing, you want to complain about him.
Well, I'm not complaining about him.
Okay.
Yeah, what I'm saying. Well, no. What I'm saying is, is there too much concentration of power? Yes, there is too much concentration of power.
If you're trying to take on a big incumbent that you complain doesn't have enough competition, it's not going to be done by someone small. Someone big has to take on someone big. So when Elon takes on Boeing, we can't blame Elon for taking on someone that no one thought could be taken on.
I think it is great that SpaceX is taking on Boeing. I wish we had
just spent 5 minutes talking how bad he was.
But how are you going to control Elon Musk's power?
I'm happy to respond if you give me a moment.
Stop. I have a question. I have a question
it.
from Jane Weisenberg. Jane, I don't know who you are. Thank you. Please, Jane, say your question loud and clear, because it's right on this.
And I hope it fits
point.
my answer.
Question is big tech too big?
Yeah,
I'm talking about Boeing.
All right,
yeah.
Jane, as fast as you can, yell it.
Yes. Thanks for being here. Given Elon Musk's new role in the Trump administration while maintaining control of X, SpaceX, and Tesla, all companies with significant government contracts and regulatory interests, how should we think about addressing these unprecedented conflicts of interest within our antitrust framework? Does our current system have adequate safeguards for this situation, or do we need new approaches?
Yes. So let me hit that, which is there are questions, right?
I'm shocked that you want to answer that.
Yeah. You want more questions first? This is an important conversation, and I appreciate it. So there are questions about whether a company. First of all, when you have massive amounts of power, you get government influence. When you have government influence and you're running the government and then you're bidding on contracts, it creates a perception of impropriety. It creates massive conflicts of interest. There are supposed to be laws. There are things called the Appointments Clause and this thing called the Constitution that's supposed to apply. And I'm not quite sure why it hasn't applied yet. And there are things that should be done about it. That is a separate question from saying whether Elon Musk has the right as SpaceX to compete against Boeing. I do think SpaceX has the right to compete against Boeing. I wish there were more competitors against Boeing. The question of this debate is big tech too big, which is why I started with the CEOs of Apple, Google, X, and Meta sitting in a rotunda, cozy and warm, at the presidential inauguration in the front row next to the family. That is a lot of political power and influence. And I think it would be naive to overlook that because the rest of the country sees it.
So First of all, no disagreement on the appointments clause, the ethics rules, any of that.
Yep.
That's exactly the type of thing you want to do. I want to talk about political power. When I sat in the White House, some of the most fearsome political power was when we were putting together the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I don't know if you remember that. It's a thing we used to have in this country. The most politically powerful interest was not the big banks, was not the insurance companies, was not the credit card companies. It was the auto dealers. They got themselves exempted from that legislation. How did they get themselves exempted from that legislation? Not because there was one of them, but because there were 435 of them. I'm getting the number a bit wrong, one in each congressional district. And they were the sort of rich person in that district. And there's nothing that antitrust and reducing their size could have done. When we were doing the Dodd-Frank Act, the group that did the best job of taking care of itself was not JP Morgan, which had a bunch of political power, but also a bunch of people that hated it. It was the community banks, which everyone loved, and they were in every district, and they got more beneficial things for themselves than any of the big banks got. The carried interest loophole, I think you're on my side on this, Gary, but regardless.
I am.
Okay, good. The carried interest loophole.
I've been scathed publicly for it, so I might as well be scathed again.
We have the carried interest loophole not because JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs want to have it. It's because we have a lot of hedge funds, private equity, venture, and they're like relatively, all of them have quite small market share in their industry, but there's a ton of them and they have a ton of money. So I think we have a big problem with wealth and power in our country, but it is not quite the same as antitrust. And when you're considering the next airline merger, and if they want to go from 4 to 3, I would consider what does that do to consumers and not say I'm going to make things better or worse for consumers. And I'm not saying it's good for consumers, by the way. It's probably bad for consumers. I would not say, like, let's look to political power or something else. We have other tools that are the right ones for that.
Yeah, Tim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I want to come back a little to our question of whether big tech is too big. And, relevant to this answer, relevant to this question. And I think that what we need to focus on in particular is the particular threat posed by the union of big government and big tech. I mean, I think that, we've been talking about China a lot. I think we want to compete with China. I don't think we want to be China. And one of the things that is the most terrifying about the Chinese model is this union of government's coercive power with the surveillance capacities and information control capacities of tech. So I want to suggest, as dangerous as auto dealers may be in raising prices, or as persuasive as community banks can be, they have nothing like the kind of power over what we say, over what is seen, over what is known about you, and over what you do that tech does. And so there are particular dangers here when we're asking if big tech is too big that are the kind of dangers we've always associated with the danger of a propaganda state, with the danger of control over human behavior. We had these problems, worse problems, in the 1930s when authoritarian governments took control of communications, when you had countries indoctrinating their populations. I'm not saying we're there right now, but I'm saying there is a particular danger of big tech getting big, a particular danger of big tech working with government that is not present in other industries.
Jaime has a question that's very much along those lines. Jaime, can you jump in with your question? And Mike's right behind you. Thanks.
Yeah, I was, let me read it real quick. So, what is it? So yeah, big tech firms not only know more about us than our own governments, but increasingly shape the flow of information that influence how we vote, what we believe, and also which voices get heard, with lobbying budgets that rival the GDP of some countries and unprecedented control over public squares. Are we witnessing the quiet erosion of democratic power, where elected institutions are being outmaneuvered by unelected tech tyrants?
I mean, I guess that kind of plays into what I just said. I think there are differences with information industries that are not present in other classic industrial industries, which is why for most countries, most of the time there are, and including in this country, particular ways of thinking about the information industries. The Constitution, our Constitution, the American Constitution, was worried about unaccountable power. And at the time, the most powerful thing was government, and it didn't have in mind private companies with the same kind of power as governments. And it didn't know about broadcasting and things like that. I think in our time, true freedom means control over private power that has control over communications and surveillance. So that's, I strongly believe that there are different kinds of dangers with information companies.
Jason and Gary, do you want to take that on? I mean, is there something different about information technology that makes it different from a Boeing or even an AT&T?
Auto dealers.
Auto dealers, yeah.
Right. There's a huge amount not to like in our media and information ecosystem. And when I said before at the beginning, if you're not on both the yes and no side of this debate, you're not thinking very clearly and rationally. But once again, I think the question is, do you think the solution of having smaller tech is better or worse than the problem that you're worried about? So back when we had a few big dominant media organizations, there was this idea, let's disintermediate them and let everyone have a voice. And now we have, Newsmax and News Nation and that really, really evil one where the person was sued for billions of dollars and has lost it, whose name...
Can't remember.
I'm not remembering, but most of you remember it. You have multiple social networks now, so you want to get your stuff out. You don't have to just use Twitter. You can use Truth Social and get that out too. So, breaking these up in some ways, more competition. How do you want to compete? Well, I'll be the social network that makes it easier to, organize terrorist attacks and share child pornography, because that's not easy enough to do on the other one. So it's not clear to me that the problems of social media, which I think are quite real and quite important, especially when it comes to things like teenagers, whether those are better or worse when you have multiple companies you can't quite yell at and take something upon themselves. So I think it's not obvious to me at all.
I would just jump in and say that the tech companies were very effective at killing legislation that would have helped address some of these kinds of social issues. And I do think that is a sign of their power and influence. Also, I kind of want to come back to this inflection point. I think part of what we want is really the paradigm shift of new markets. And I was talking about the kind of inflection points earlier, but really, when you have these sort of winner-take-most type platforms, what you're looking for is kind of the off-ramp, the disruption, the new idea that nobody can imagine that sends things off in a different direction. And again, I hope there are a lot of people out here who will be responsible for inventing those new technologies and those new businesses and bringing them to market. What concerns me as now a former antitrust enforcer is when the incumbents put up roadblocks, unnecessary roadblocks, not by innovating, but by putting moats in front of their businesses that keep those entrepreneurs from coming up with product solutions to address some of these problems. I think a lot of the problems in social media suffer from a lack of innovation around how to address some of these societal issues, safety, security, privacy. I would say that I think if there were more on-ramps for entrepreneurs, we'd actually have more solutions to choose from, and hopefully someday we will.
Competition gives people more of what they want, and one thing they want is, some people, consumers want, is privacy. They don't tend to seem to want that much. People also want all sorts of bad things. They want to get information that they like. They don't want to see information that contradicts what they want. Right. They want to be able to consume conspiracy theories, organized bullying, et cetera. And competition gives them more of that too. And that's the problem.
No, it could be, right? But first of all, I mean, behaviorally, like we put in our Google case a behavioral economist and scientist up to talk about how the companies actually feed off the behavioral instincts and they create addictive products. That's where you might want to have regulation. You might want to have some privacy and safety and security. And again, I go back to my concern that the companies have actually blocked that.
That's no different if it's a big company or a small social media company. A standalone social media company that has large distribution, or a bunch of social media companies together.
But the big company is going to have a lot more power in blocking that legislation than the small company.
I don't think you guys understood Jason's point. There's power in any organization that gets together. If you have a automobile dealership in every congressional district and you're giving money to the congressperson, you've got enormous power. If you got a community bank in every congressional district, you've got power. Just because you're sitting in the inauguration doesn't necessarily give you power. In fact, I would almost argue that it takes away power because you're in the crosshairs. You'd much prefer to be in the background. Having served in the White House, I know that you don't want to be front and center. I was actually part of government Sachs. You forgot about government Sachs. You left that out of your argument. There was a time when Goldman Sachs was running the U.S. government too. Didn't really work out well for them either. So you have all these theories about all these people, but I would argue the people that were sort of in the second tier of influencers in Washington tended to get a lot more of what they wanted, like the automobile dealers, like the regional banks, like the coal miners, who are in a lot of congressional districts that no one really wants to hear from, and they don't make a splash, they don't protest, they just show up in their congressman's office. There's a lot of people that show up and have political power. This whole idea that only big companies have political power.
I'm going to cut this
Paul
off
Weiss
for a second.
Paul Weiss got 2 hours in the Oval Office.
All right,
that wasn't a sign of their power.
You're going to have a few minutes to wrap this all up. I want to get a few more questions from the audience. Olga has a very different kind of question.
Oh, good.
You've got the microphone behind you. We have not touched on labor at all.
Okay, so this is a question about labor. Do we need more protections for tech workers who want to form or participate in unions? If so, what kind of protections?
I guess I'll take that, although I'm going to first talk about this power thing. The problem here with this conversation is we're talking about different kinds of power, which is to say you're talking about the power to influence or stop legislation and so forth, power over Congress. I'm talking about power over the population and citizens. And what my concern with tech power is not that they'll be able to block legislation, although they have been very successful. I wasted my time trying to get privacy legislation passed when I was in the White House. But it's not that. It's the power over us that I'm concerned about. And I think that tech companies and any company that is equipped with surveillance capabilities and has the control over what people see and hear and the ability to sort of poke people in different directions just has a certain kind of power that we need to be concerned about that is a different part of this debate than whether or not they can block legislation and whether or not the auto dealers can get together and get themselves a loophole. And, that's one form, this is another. And I think we have to stay, focused on that particular kind of power as being dangerous. As for organized labor, I think there's been enormous imbalance in the power between employers and employees for a long time. I don't think tech is any different. Tech is, do I need special protections? They need the protections. They have protections in the law. There needs to be better enforcement of the labor protections. And honestly, on behalf of the labor movement, it needs to, do a good job of convincing people that it's worth it and that they can. I think they've come back. I think a lot more people are interested in unions right now, but I don't think we necessarily need a special law for protecting labor unions in tech. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I don't think we need a special law for it, and there's a whole lot of things that we could discuss about labor power in general, but some of which I'd agree with, a bunch of which I'd agree with Tim. The one thing I would say is wages in the United States are much higher than wages in Europe. That's because productivity in the United States is much higher than productivity in Europe, and almost that entire difference in productivity between the two is the tech sector. And so the biggest thing we can do for wages is foster productivity, and I think we all agree. That requires a lot of competition and innovation.
Can I come back to something Jason also said? So Jason was talking about, what is worse, having a couple big social media companies or having small ones that might be catering to different and more dangerous tendencies. The big model, we have sort of, say, Facebook or whatever, they're the monopolist, and you're just dealing with one company. It can be good, but it's risky. You're taking an enormous risk when you're saying, okay, this is the one company that's going to have everything. Now, as long as, they're well-intentioned, so that gives them a lot of power. And if they're well-intentioned and if they sort of have this sense of noblesse obligée or something and they behave like CBS in the 1960s, maybe that's one thing. What if they start to turn? What if they start to think, well, we have all this power, maybe we should start using it? Then I would say a much more decentralized social media network is a lot less dangerous. And frankly, as I come back to, I think the core idea that the constitutional framers of this country had is that unaccountable power is dangerous. And whether that power is in government or whether that power is in the one social media network that we are trusting to be good, I think is an unacceptable situation. There are inefficiencies in decentralization, but we chose that constitutional course because we think concentrated, unaccountable power is dangerous, and that's true in a social media network. It's also true in a federal government.
I'm going to give Kyle the last question here because I think it sort of serves as a bit of a summation. And apologies to the rest of the students, sorry.
I'll read my question and then maybe I'll make it a little more pointed. How should legislation be structured that would prevent big tech abuse while not hamstringing continued performance or innovation? And I think for the pro-big tech people, maybe if you guys could focus on areas that you believe big tech abuse is happening and what you would do to fix it. And maybe for the anti-big tech people, is there such legislation that would make it an even playing field such that if these same companies kept winning and kept growing, you think that would be the right thing to happen?
I'll hit it. So there have been a bunch of legislative proposals that have had bipartisan support. I think the trick is focusing on competition in the competitive process so that companies have to earn their way to success and making sure that there are, again, lines on the road so that the rules of competition have some bounds, but within those bounds, companies can innovate and compete on price and other dimensions to their heart's content. And then to the extent that companies win because they're better, then I think our system does reward that, but it also means that you can't use that power now to box out others in the future or leverage that or tie that power into other new markets. And so I think we just need some basic lines on the road. Antitrust enforcement is a really good way to do that, but there may be other areas where some legislation is important. When it comes to things like privacy and security, there have been a lot of sensible proposals. None of them have, again, with bipartisan support, none of them have gotten out of the chambers. And I think there needs to be some safety and security. These technologies, to Tim's point, are not just car dealers. They're having effects on children's brains, and I think we have to have an honest conversation about the significance of that.
All right. Do you want to go?
I mean, on sort of legislative power, by the way, you do the full listing of what these companies have lobbied on. They also want more immigration to the United States. They want more research funding in universities. They don't think that'll be competition for them. They would like more education and skills upgrading in our country. I worked on a piece of legislation, or against a piece of legislation a decade ago called SOPA and PIPA. I can't remember even what they stood for, but it was the content industry wanted them, and it would have really done quite a lot to hurt the big tech. Big tech stopped that, and I think you were on the same side, Tim, and yeah. Big tech was on the sort of side of justice and righteousness.
We were co-workers, as you recall.
On that one. So there's an awful lot of companies on multiple sides, and sometimes the companies win, sometimes the companies lose. And by the way, our immigration in our country, we would be a much more open, much more tolerant, much more diverse country if big tech was as powerful as they think it was, and I wish we were. I think that outstrips in importance everything else we're talking about here. In terms of what I do, I mean, I chaired a panel for the UK government. They established a digital markets unit. It's pro-competition regulation. But the goal of that and the premise wasn't these companies are too big and we want them to be smaller. It wasn't we want to break them up. It's we want to create a more competitive landscape. And that more competitive landscape might even mean they're bigger. Because they get less fat and lazy, like Tim wants, because now they're more afraid of other companies, so they need to innovate more. It might mean they're smaller, and it's this preconception that we know what the size should be, as opposed to all of you, consumers, should be deciding the size, and they should be competing. And by the way, the winner might get to be bigger as a result of winning. So that is my objection to this, is that you don't want to think of your solutions as reducing their size. You want to think of solutions as having greater competition.
So we are nearing the end of our time. So what I'm going to ask each team to do, and this is hard because you can't really confer, is just kind of give us your best arguments in 5 minutes per side. Because right after these closing arguments, we are going to vote again, and we are curious to see which of these arguments will actually sort of sway the minds in this room. Do either of you feel strongly about going first? All right.
Go first since we went first.
All right, gentlemen.
First, because Jake decided to go first on every question.
We could argue about that for a while. Give us the best argument.
Well, look, let's start with number one and number two best arguments. All these platforms they're talking about, you choose to use them. No one has a gun to your head to use any one of these platforms. In fact, I'm not on any social media platforms. Sorry. So I know you can survive without being on any social media platforms. Number two,
Disagree.
What?
I disagree. Go on.
That you can survive?
Yeah.
I've made it this far. I got a birthday coming up soon. We'll see. Number two, everyone in this room has benefited. Every one of you has benefited. Every small business has benefited. Our economy has benefited. We didn't go in the last 50 years from a $2 trillion economy to a $30 trillion economy because we got lucky. We did something right. We made the barriers to entry for small business people so much lower. When you think about it, where we were 10 or 15 years ago to go create a business and go create a infrastructure, go create a network, go create storage, go create compute, you would spend $250,000 to $500,000 to go start a small business. Today, you can do it for virtually nothing. Almost all of these companies will give it away to you. You can sign up for a cloud account. You can all work from home. You can all work off your personal computers. We have created a landscape where business is thriving. It's not an accident that last year we had a record year for new small business applicants. We had 5.5 new small business applicants in the United States. It was a record. It surpassed the 5.1 of 2020. So we continue to grow. We continue to thrive. We continue to use these things. Our lives are more efficient. You know, I don't know. When I go to a meeting and it's in my calendar and my map tells me to leave now because there's bad traffic, I benefit from that. I'm less late than I would normally be, but I benefit from it. We all benefit this. This is driving the economy. Then the last point I'll make, and I'll leave the rest to Jason, is like we're having these convoluted arguments about the U.S. and Europe and all this. Think about Europe. Europe has had a dormant economy for the exact same period of time where our GDP has gone up 15-fold. Why? There's no venture capital. There's no entrepreneurial spirit. Another fact is, over 50% of the startup companies in this country were founded by or are led by an immigrant. And it's well over 50%. Why? They come here because there's opportunity. They don't come here because they're afraid of competition. They don't come here because they think they're going to be stifled. They come here because they think this is the best place to start a company where the consumers will reward them for a good idea. And I'll yield my other half back to you, Jason.
Yeah, I just think about my day. I woke up this morning.
That's good. It's good that you woke up.
ChatGPT, what are the best arguments I can use against Tim? I then went on to Signal and just sort of listened in on some of the conversations, how we're going to defend Taiwan and the Chinese invasion. I used my maps to figure out how to get to my office because I can get confused about that, especially coming over here to the business school. I've used these products like a couple hours today. And I think the idea that they're controlling me, as opposed to I'm deciding what to seek out, what information to get, who I trust, who I don't trust on social media. And by the way, you should all trust and follow me. And you can do it on Twitter, Blue Sky, or Threads. I multi-home on all three. It's not that hard to do. You know, I just think you can trust people. You trust people economically. Politically, do I have 100% of trust in everyone 100% of the time? No. But I don't really have an alternative mechanism that I think is better. And the idea that the government would come along and say, you know what, this is a company you all liked, but we're going to raise the price or make them, you know, charge you money or make it so that the way in which they're funding themselves don't work because they have some bank shot theory that somehow that means that Elon Musk will have to stand out in the cold rather than getting that cool seat he got. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't take our chances with our productivity. I wouldn't take our chances with what consumers want. And I think that there are other mechanisms and other tools to solve our problems, and making our big companies smaller just isn't going to do it.
Thank you. Best arguments?
All right, I'm going to start with 2 points and then leave the rest for Jonathan. This is not an argument as to whether the U.S. has the best tech industry in the world, because we do have the best tech industry, and we have some of the strongest inventions and technologies and culture. The question is keeping it that way and what has done it. And the idea that this has, sort of happened by itself without government intervention, government is completely wrong. We have a history since frankly, since the 1920s, but at least since the 1950s, of forceful government intervention into tech to break up and hold the largest companies to task over and over and over again. And we went through it again. We chased around IBM. We broke up AT&T. We went after Microsoft. We imposed net neutrality rules on the cable companies. We've been constantly involved in this sector to keep it competitive. And what they're actually asking for is a change from the status quo, an idea that now these companies, the industry can take care of itself, that it's not going to become, as I said, fat and lazy like every other government-connected giant industry, and that we can just trust it. So they're actually arguing from a break from what has been a very successful policy over the last 50 years of the government constantly intervening to make sure and to trap the excesses of monopoly power, which is the antitrust law, which has been in place since 1890 anyways. So, in fact, their position is more radical to break from what we've had. The second point I think is the most important, answering this question, is big tech too big? I think we come back to the fact that there is something special about the tech industry, about industries that handle information, that have surveillance capabilities, that control what you see or what you do. Now, is some of that within our control? Yes. But is there an enormous power in that capability? Is this a power that has been abused over the 20th and 21st centuries when you look at the history of propaganda and government control? Yes. Are we moving in that direction in ways that are, in my view, are rather alarming? Yes. All of this suggests that big tech, as Jonathan is going to argue, is too powerful. And coming back to the constitutional vision, the United States should be and must always remain suspicious of unaccountable power. We have a problem with unaccountable power in our times. I don't think we can just trust a few very powerful tech executives to do the right thing when it comes to the future of the United States and its freedom of speech. And so therefore, this is why we need to be serious about this problem, both continuing our tradition of maintaining competition and also being serious about protecting privacy and other interests. So that is the two arguments on our side.
Jonathan, final words.
Yeah. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration sought to break up AT&T by forcing AT&T to divest a company called Western Electric. They said we needed to, because AT&T required you to rent a phone from the phone company. It required you have a certain kind of plug to plug your phone in. They were stifling innovation. And so the Reagan administration forced them to divest the hardware from the line. And that's why you have your iPhone today. Otherwise, you probably have a rotary cell phone sold by AT&T. The fact of the matter is, deconcentration of power has worked as a matter of economic policy. The Microsoft case led to remedies that allowed Apple to distribute iTunes on Windows, which ultimately led to the strength and success of the iPod, which resulted in the success of the iPhone and the innovations. Google and its browsers and its incredible search technology grew up on a Windows machine. Had Microsoft won that case, they would have had the ability to stifle all that innovation in its inception. I think what we are saying is we just want to make sure that competition, that innovation, that entrepreneurship is what drives us so that we can compete more effectively, not by being like China, but by being more like our best selves. Finally, I think and to build on what Tim said, I'm a father, and I can tell you kids are affected in a great way by social media. Kids are affected in a great way by phones. Kids are affected in a great way, as are adults, by the divisive nature of these technologies. They have incredible effects over our lives. I've seen the documents as an enforcer. They know what they're doing. They're influencing us. They have the ability, like dogs being zapped in the yard with an invisible fence, to keep us from going this direction or that direction. That is a lot of power. And it is a long-standing tradition going back to the founding of this country that we should be suspicious of companies or governments that have and exert too much power.
Thank you for doing such an excellent job We will give them all a round of applause in a moment. First, we are going to put the QR code up on the screen. And I hope you will all take this opportunity to vote for this final moment, and I will get the results momentarily. While that is happening, I'll just note a couple things that really struck me. First of all, amazing set of arguments in real time. Thanks to all of you. But what struck me was actually a fairly surprising level of agreement. I think everybody here agrees that competition is fundamentally important to both our economic system and to our political system. And I think everyone here is devoted to competition and worried about seeing a concentration of power, be it at the economic level or more worrisome at the political level. I think there's some disagreement about the current moment of technology we're in, whether it's giving you happy moments on Signal, as you use the map function, which has made us all stupider because we no longer know where we are, or whether embedded in these technologies is something scary, something that could undermine, again, both economic competition and worse, political competition. So I think there's actually a fair bit of overlap, and I think if we had more time to sort of figure out, well, is competition law the right hammer? Is it regulation? Is it political corruption that we're worried about? We might even be able to get to some agreement. And I believe I will have the results of our vote momentarily.
I don't like seeing it.
No, it's a little scary.
Yeah,
all right.
We had nothing to lose.
Do I have the envelope, please?
We had nothing to lose.
All right.
That's true.
All right. So we have had some movement in our swing votes. Is big tech too big? That number has actually declined from 70% to 67%. Is big tech too big? No, that number has gone up from 18% to 29%. So you guys win by losing. So thank you very much. And really, thank you all for participating in this debate. I think it's been wonderful to see the fight. Thank you all, and on to the next time. Thank you.